That's where it got the name White House. But originally it was called the President's Mansion. But it was painted over and painted white. Anyway, then the British went from there to Fort McHenry, outside of Baltimore, 40 miles away. Now here's the story of Fort McHenry. As the British were getting ready to shell Fort McHenry, they saw a man, a lawyer, who was going about his business, a young lawyer named Francis Scott Key. And they said, Francis Scott Key, I mean, we know you don't mean this harm, but we have to take you on board. So Francis Scott Key was taken on board a British ship. And on that same ship that's held down below were some American prisoners of war. So Francis Scott Key, being a civilian, was allowed to go up top and look out over the ramparts. And as the sun went down, there was the American flag. Now, folk, I've seen this flag. It was about half the size of this walls of this classroom. I mean, it's huge. Anyway, it has some holes in it. It was hit by a few fragments. Anyway, the American flag was flying full staff when the sun went down. And throughout the night, Francis Scott Key would see the flag. And he'd go down and tell the men below, the flag is still there. Then he'd climb back up and look out over the ramparts. He could see the flag every time a rocket was fired. By the rocket's red glare, yep, the flag is still there. Every time a bomb was sent off and it burst in midair, fireworks, the flag is still there. He'd go down below and tell the men, oh, the flag is there. I saw it. But 2 hours before daylight, the shelling stopped. Now this was a really, really dark night, a night with no moon. Francis Scott Key could not get anything with Britain. The British weren't going to tell him anything, of course. The British had decided they couldn't take Fort McHenry. They were going to go on to New Orleans, but they didn't tell him that. But just before the sun came up, the sun's light, before coming, it would hit the upper atmosphere. And by the dawn's early light, Francis Scott Key saw it. The flag was there. And he went down below and said, man, the flag is still there. Francis Scott Key was so inspired that he wrote a poem about it. The poem begins with, oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming. And one of the lines is, and by the rocket's red glare and the bombs bursting gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. This poem was made into a song. This song was made into a tune, and the tune became the national anthem. I've heard it was once a beer song, be that as it may. Some of the songs in the hymn books were beer songs. God Any Rivers to Cross was one of them. There Is a Fountain was another. You'll see in a lot of hymn books, they once were beer songs. Nobody had any rights to the tunes, so anybody could use it. Now, about you all hopefully know that by now I'm talking about the national anthem. The words play ball that you often hear at the end of the anthem are not part of the original text. They represent not even an official later edition. All right, so much for that. All right, anyway. The French then went on from Fort McHenry to New Orleans, and they met Andrew Jackson. Now, Andrew Jackson had 4,000 men, and the British had 9,000. The British had 9,000. The British troops were from the Napoleonic Wars, and they marched straight and tall. They hadn't learned their lesson from General Braddock. Jackson's men were crouched behind cotton bales. The cotton was a plentiful. Now, the Battle of New Orleans was a strange battle in that it was fought after the war was over. Unknown to Andrew Jackson, unknown to the British and Americans had come to an agreement, a peace treaty, in December. The Battle of New Orleans was fought in January. And they might think, wasn't it cold in January? No, not in New Orleans, it wasn't. The British marched straight and tall. Jackson said, make every shot count. Don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes, according to Montreal. The Americans fired a volley of shots in the British. A bunch of British soldiers dropped down. The British kept coming. The Americans reloaded and shot again. A bunch of British started running, and when one Britisher started running, they all did. The whole British army ran. 2 of the British generals were killed, but the British army ran pell-mell from the battlefield. One of the biggest victories of the war. This victory really propelled Andrew Jackson to heroism and ultimately to the presidency of the United States. Anyway, Battle of New Orleans. Now, Tecumseh, meantime, went around trying to drum up support. He went all the way, from through Indiana and then Kentucky and Tennessee and down as far as Mississippi and Alabama to try to get a bunch of Indians together. Again, too late, folk. When is he going to learn? He couldn't get enough Indians together. He tried to fight William Henry Harrison. They fought Harrison at the Battle of Tippecanoe. I don't think that's spelled right. Anyway, the Battle of Tippecanoe was won by William Henry Harrison, who later, by the way, became President of the United States. William Henry Harrison won the Battle of Tippecanoe, and that propelled him to being one of America's heroes. The American Indians were forced into becoming drunks and disease-ridden and basically somewhat worthless. All right. After the War of 1812 was over, James Madison quit after 8 years. He served his 8 years. He turned the presidency over to James Monroe. Virginians held the presidency for 24 years. Thomas Jefferson 8, James Madison 8, James Monroe 8. 24 years the presidency was held by Virginians. Now, during James Monroe's term, you had a compromise worked up. Missouri wanted to come into the Union as a slave state. Well, in the Senate, in the House of Representatives, there were far more representatives who were anti-slave than were slave. But in the Senate, there was an equal number of slave states and equal number of free. Well, Missouri was denied admission, owing to the fact that if Missouri came in, there would be more slave voters in the Senate than there were voters from free states. And a lot of your northern people objected to that, so Missouri was denied admission. But into the scenario stepped a man called the Great Compromiser, Henry Clay. Henry Clay, all right, the word compromise means that each side gives in a little bit. You don't hold an opinion so strong that, folk, there are certain times this is when you cannot compromise. When someone is doing, someone said that what the Israelis should do with the Arabs is decide that, well, let's say you can kill half of us and let the other half of us live. The Arabs want them all killed. Or maybe you can kill all of us halfway, half kill all of us and let us half live. You can't work a compromise under certain conditions. But, all right, leaving that. About this time, Maine broke away from Massachusetts. And Maine asked that they be allowed into the Union as a free state. So Henry Clay worked up his first colony. He said, let's let them both in. So around sometime shortly after, all this took months. It didn't happen overnight. Sometime shortly after 1820, Missouri came into the Union as a slave state. Maine came into the Union as a free state. And the number of slave states and free remained the same. Now this was a deal that could not last forever, folk. Eventually something was going to happen. But now here's part of the Missouri Compromise that's going to lead to trouble later. They drew a line. They drew a line that extends south of Missouri, no, actually north of Missouri. And it said from now on, all states north of this line will be free, and all states south of this line will be slave. In other words, Kansas was to come in when it came in, it was to come in as a slave state. Nebraska free. Colorado would be slave. Wyoming free, and so on. Utah free. Utah slave, and Nevada and California slave. Now that worked for a while. But we're going to find out later there came a southern state that didn't want to come into the Union as a slave state, namely California. They said, no, we want to come in as a free state, and they were south of the line. And that created problems for them. But for the compromise worked for about 30 years, until 1850. All right. In the meantime, now, let's see, how much time do I have? About 30 minutes. All right. Meantime, over in Europe, the Napoleonic Wars were going on, and Spain was fighting France, as I've already mentioned. Well, a bunch of Spanish people got the idea, and I mean, I'm talking about Spanish people in the New World, hey, we can break away from Spain just like the 13 colonies broke away from England. Let's do it. So Mexico broke away from Spain, and the Spanish could do nothing about it. In the meantime, a man named Simon Bolivar led 6 nations to freedom, among them Colombia, Ecuador, Bolivia, which was named after Bolivar. And down in the south, San Martin led Argentina to freedom from Spain. Now, Brazil was under Portugal. Brazil stayed with Portugal. But most of your big Latin American countries broke away from Spain at this time. The exceptions, Puerto Rico and Cuba did not. Those were islands, and they felt like they had no place to hide, so they didn't fight. But the other countries did, and Spain lost its New World possessions, except for the islands. And this upset the Spanish terribly, but then again, they had to spend their time and resources fighting Napoleon. When the war was over, Spain asked the other nations of Europe, hey, will you please help us get our territory back? At this point, Great Britain and the United States forgot their quarrels, got together. President Monroe sent a document called the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine said that any nation that comes to fight against a nation in the Western Hemisphere will have to fight the United States also. Great Britain said any nation that moves to reconquer these nations Great Britain benefited greatly from trade. Now that Spain was out of the way, Great Britain could negotiate directly with the traders. Great Britain said any nation that comes in to help Spain get its territories back will face hostility to Great Britain. So if the United States and Britain stood together, the nations of Europe said we're tired of war, and for the next 99 years, Europe was largely at peace. They had fought several wars in the 1700s, then they fought Napoleon in the early 1800s, and they went 99 from 1815 to 1914, largely at peace with each other. Anyway, Monroe Doctrine. Oh yeah, part of the Monroe Doctrine said the United States will not help any European country fight any wars in Europe. In the 20th century, we broke that twice when we sided against Germany in World War II, in World War I and World War II. All right. Now you come to the election of 1824. In the election of 1824, Monroe had already served his 8 years, so 5 candidates entered the race. John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams, John Quincy Adams, Crawford, Clay, Calhoun, and Jackson. The other ones I want you to worry about are Adams and Jackson. Make a long story short, Henry Clay's name was dropped from the list. The election was undecided by the Electoral College, so it went to the House of Representatives, as is called for in the Constitution. But during this time, it is believed that Henry Clay and John Adams got together and made a deal where that Henry Clay said to John Quincy Adams, I will support you if you make me Secretary of State. Now, folks, this was done in your own lifetime when Barack Obama made the same kind of deal with Hillary Clinton, and I'm not going to say it was anything wrong, folks. This is the way politics is run in Washington. In Washington, now don't any of you try this, but if any of you were to come up to me and say this, I'll give you $50 if you'll raise my grade to 1 letter, I'd have to say no, firmly no. But these kind of bargains go on in Washington all the time. The congressman, you've got a bill up that you need some votes for, and I got a bill up, I'll tell you what, I will support your bill if you will support mine. It's standard procedure, it's called log rolling. Now, if Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams made this deal, it was just normal politics, nothing wrong with it, but Andrew Jackson made a big deal of it. He said, there's a corrupt bargain going on between two men, and they destroyed the will of the people. So Andrew Jackson and his men waited noisily for the election of 1828. John Quincy Adams, like his father, was only a one-term president. Adams did not know that when the president cannot fire a congressman. The president cannot fire a senator. The president cannot fire a court member. But the president can fire a member of his own cabinet. The president can fire anyone in the executive department. John Quincy Adams refused to fire people whom he knew were supporting Jackson in his own cabinet. He refused to fire people in the executive branch whom he knew were hostile to him by any reasonable. I mean, he was not a Donald Trump. So much for that. Hardly. He had a dream of setting up a national observatory. He was interested in science. He wants to have a national observatory in Washington to observe the stars. Congress wouldn't fund it. Basically, the Congress was against him every term. And he finally was defeated. Now, this brings us up to the election of 1828. And for the first time in history, a popular vote chose the most of the electors. In other words, Andrew Jackson was the first election actually elected a popular vote, and he was elected in 1828. The campaign, though, was exceptionally dirty. All right, here's part of the story of Andrew Jackson. In those days, people traveled around, and if they got tired late at night, they'd knock on the door and ask if they could stay for the night, and people would keep each other. It's standard procedure. Some people would build a room just adjacent, attached to their house, and leave it unlocked, and anybody who wanted to come in could come in any time, no questions asked. We don't do that today, of course. But one day, Andrew Jackson knocked on the door of a house, and a really attractive woman answered the door. They fell in love at first sight. But when Andrew Jackson and Rachel got to talking to each other, he learned that Rachel had been married. She married a soldier, and he was apparently shell-shocked, or maybe suffering what we might call PTSD. His relatives said it was something the war had done to him. I mean, it's a lot. Anyway, Rachel could not live with him. She left him and went back to her parents, but she never got a divorce. Well, Andrew Jackson said, I'll help you get a divorce from this man. But somehow, this part of the story we know. The rest of it is lost somewhere in the paperwork in the shuffle. It was later found that after Andrew Jackson and Rachel were married, that there were no divorce papers. Well, Andrew Jackson quickly got some divorce papers together and got them through the courts and got a legal divorce. The law allowing divorce had just been passed. With all respect, I mean, divorce had been illegal until very recently, at that time, very recently, and there was not any really defined formal procedure for it. And Rachel's divorce from her first husband was not all that clear. But every one of us believes that Rachel actually intended to divorce him and thought she was divorced. Both thought. Andrew Jackson and Rachel thought that they were divorced, that her and her first husband were divorced. Anyway, Rachel Jackson was called an adulteress, called all kinds of names. She became an angry, bitter woman. Jackson took out his frustration by dueling. But the last man he dueled, well, at one point he challenged Henry Clay to a duel. I said Henry Clay refused. But the last man he dueled, since Jackson challenged, this man was allowed to shoot first. He put a bullet in Jackson's chest. Didn't kill him, but Jackson was to spend the rest of his life suffering from mercury poisoning and lead poisoning, and in a lot of pain. Jackson got his shot off and killed the man who he was dueling. All told, Jackson killed 2 men in duels. And this worked against him. Jackson's fiery temper and Jackson's dueling worked against him. The campaign was a dirty one, a nasty one, to say the least. Jackson said, I'm going to walk the steps of the White House with Rachel by my side. He didn't. The election went to Jackson. Jackson was elected in November, but it took weeks for him to learn he was elected because, then again, news traveled slowly. In December, Jackson learned that he was elected President of the United States. He prepared to go to Washington with Rachel by his side. He was to take office in March. In those days, presidents did not take office in January. Rachel died of a heart attack suddenly, late in December. Jackson walked up the steps of the White House alone. This influenced Jackson's decisions a lot, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Because Jackson's own wife had been slandered, And one of the members of Jackson's cabinet was also, his wife was slandered. And Jackson wound up siding with this slandered woman. All right. I'm making things easier for myself, folk.